The US's 2022 National Defense Strategy names China as Washington's pacing challenge, with Russia an acute threat. Today, we're privileged to get an insider's view on American national security and an assessment on Taiwan's defenses. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining me in the studio today are Ivan Kanapathy, a Vice President at Beacon Global Strategies and a Senior Associate and Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, formerly U.S. National Security Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia, and Deputy Senior Director for Asian Affairs. Ivan also served as a military attache at the American Institute in Taiwan and was an F-18 naval flight officer and Top Gun instructor. And Vincent Chow, former political director for TECRO, Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States, and currently adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Asia Program and China Project, Power. And earlier I spoke to Gregory B. Poling, who directs the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, also at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is a senior fellow and author of On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea. Ivan, Vincent, welcome to the show.
Ian, great to be here.
Ivan, before we get into the US defense and security, let's take a look at Taiwan's defense. At a recent security forum in Taipei, you advised against publishing incursions into the air defense zone and across the median line, and also against sending jets to warn off these planes. Why was that?
So if we talk about the air defense identification zone, I think Taiwan's view and utility of it is a little different than you would see among other countries. For example, the United States has an air defense identification zone, and we make a point when we publish, for example, Russian incursions into it, of saying that this flight from Russia was within legal bounds, it was normal, it wasn't something that violates anything. And that's sort of something that we stress, and I don't think that's happening with Taiwan, and there might be a misunderstanding being created within Taiwanese society, and then secondly, possibly over time, a sense of complacency in Taiwan about these incursions. It's not that they shouldn't respond necessarily to all of them, but I think at the farther reaches of the ADIZ, they're probably not relevant to Taiwan's defense.
Vincent, what's your view on this?
I think absolutely. I think over the past 2 years, the Ministry of National Defense here has transitioned, I think, its responses to different incursions into this ADIZ. But I do think, to Ivan's point, I mean, I think there's clarity to be made there. ADIZ isn't territorial airspace. I think it's international airspace to a certain extent, but there is obviously a defense, I think, association to that. And so I think, to Ivan's point, I think Ivan wants to emphasize the point that it may not necessarily be helpful to have this constant sense of panic within either Taiwan society or the international society at large. But I do think at least there is value in continuing to obviously to monitor these incursions, to compile these incursions for patterns and other analysis we can take away from it. But also I think to let our public know sort of the severity of China's military adventurism in this region. So I do think there is a balance to be made there. It's similar to, I think, how we should see our responses to these overflights. I mean, obviously, I think it's quite taxing for both our airframes as well as our pilots for us to be able to send fighter jets to respond to every single incursion by aging, like H-6 bomber and so forth. But I think there needs to be a prioritization, for example, of incursions that may merit a response and incursions that are just more routine in nature.
So Ivan, that would actually help with the maintenance cost, obviously, for Taiwan's defense too.
Yeah, it would. I mean, there are some ADIZ incursions in the southwest corner, which we saw a lot of early on in 2020, 2021, that are actually occurring in airspace that's a lot closer to China than it is to Taiwan. So when you look at things that way, sort of the idea that Taiwan needs to launch fighters all the way out there to respond, at which point, quite frankly, the fighters can't remain on station for very long. And then if you look at the trends, if the idea that responding is providing deterrence, I think you could argue that given the trends of increasing incursions, that we're not really succeeding.
That it's not really working.
Right.
Yeah. So the message that's being sent out is one of sort of, well, as you said, inability to deter, and that weakens Taiwan's position.
I think in some ways it's helping China's political warfare. I think you could make that argument too.
I think I'll put it in a slightly different sense. I think there was a lot of value in making public these incursions over the past 2 years. I think it jolted, I think, both the international community as well as the Taiwanese public to the fact that that military adventurism was taking place across the Taiwan Strait. And I think that has inherent value. I think that was valuable in that sense. I think, to Ivan's point is the question about how much value that brings going forward, given that, this is here to stay. It's not going to be one-off incursions from then forward. I think we're going to see much, much more of this as time goes by. And so I think that value proposition needs to be determined and evaluated in this context.
Ivan, you also told the Nikkei, this was straight after U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, that Taiwan defenses had a narrow window. And this wasn't for reform, as you said it, but transformation. So there's two parts to this. When do you think China would have the capability to invade Taiwan? And secondly, what transformation is needed?
Right. So I think that for China's capability, my view is that they're probably not confident right now that they could invade Taiwan. They are working on some things that I think we believe in the public space we can point to that will get them to a place where they're going to be much more confident, toward the end of this decade. So 5-6 years out, possibly. And that has to do with a couple capabilities that I think they're slightly deficient on. One, on the one side, it's basically lift capacity to get troops across. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to put boots on the ground to kind of take possession of territory.
And this was a significant difference with Ukraine.
Yes, right. And so China doesn't, because Ukraine's got a land border, that's really the significant difference, that they don't need this tremendous capability to get across the water, which is a challenge. And then the second thing that I think China feels that they need to have is this, a better nuclear capability. And that has to do with the United States and achieving more of a level of sort of mutual parity where China feels like they can embark on something that's inherently going to be escalatory. I think they feel quite in a disadvantage right now, given our nuclear capabilities and what they have, and they're working rapidly to correct that.
How do we measure that? Is that in the number of nuclear warheads?
It's in the number of warheads. It's also the different types of paths that they can deliver them. So they've gone in recent years from just having sort of land-based siloed missiles and maybe some road mobiles to now really having a legitimate capability to deliver from submarines, to deliver from aircraft. And also, they're obviously working on improving the missiles, including hypersonic technology and things like that. So having more sort of varied ways that can get through our defenses and having more warheads, which I think our assessment right now is that they will have, they're going to go from 200 or 300 warheads to over 1,000 by the end of the decade.
And so that compares to the US's,
I think the U.S. is 2,000 or 3,000. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But yeah, it's somewhere in that number.
So much smaller gap. Yeah. Vincent, what do you think about the recent repetition by Secretary of State Antony Blinken talking about the acceleration of Beijing's plans for reunification?
I think we do have to separate sort of the political dynamic and the strategic dynamic of it. And so our understanding, based previously when I was in TECRO, was that this all referred to capabilities, to having the capabilities for Xi Jinping to be able to be given that political decision-making capacity. So Xi Jinping may want to invade Taiwan today, and certainly I think his predecessors may have considered this at various points of time, but they simply did not have the level of confidence they needed to go ahead with such a plan without potentially jeopardizing their own political stability in China, not to mention their levels of success in such a campaign. And so I think what Xi Jinping is aiming to do, at least by 27 and beyond, is have that confidence level and have that level where they can engage in such adventurous and military incursions while minimizing risk and cost towards the CCP. And so, you know, I do think back to my first point about differentiating into, because we're pointing to a strategic capability right now, a military capacity right now. But, you know, that does not necessarily correlate to a political decision-making time frame by 27 or 28 or beyond. I think there are various factors that would flow into that. I think foremost would be the risks of not doing anything outweighing the risks of doing anything. And that would probably be one key metric we should continue to be on watch for, because I think that is obviously going to be something that will become much, much more prominent probably in 27 and beyond.
Mm-hmm. And then, Ivan, on the Taiwan side, going back to my initial question, the transformation that's needed, is this the shift to asymmetric warfare that, you know, that Taiwan has accepted and has begun?
Yeah, I think Taiwan has accepted it. They've begun it. It's a question of sort of how fast you're willing to, you know, break some of the rice bowls and kind of really change the force structure. I mean, there's a lot to do when you want to shift the bureaucracy, as folks understand. And it requires making some hard choices, because it's not just a question of adding capabilities. It's a question of, you know, someone's going to have to make a decision to get rid of certain capabilities, at least in some levels. And so I think Ukraine has really sort of taught some lessons. I think there will be more lessons and more debates about that. But, you know, the one kind of critical thing that Taiwan needs to focus on, I think, is having an adequate number of munitions here on the island. I think that's critical, especially as we look at Ukraine and the fact that we've had to ship a lot of munitions to Ukraine across the border from Poland, what have you. And we may not have that option. It's highly likely that we won't have those kind of options if something happens here.
There's talk of actually joint manufacture, where the weapons are actually made in Taiwan, so that the weapons are actually here, and then U.S. technology transfers. How much of that do you know? How far progressed is this?
So even historically, there have been a number of joint military development programs in Taiwan, including Taiwan's indigenous defense fighter, including Taiwan's indigenous defense submarine that I think is in the works. We'll have some U.S. technology and various other things. It's again, a question of sort of how fast we can get to those things. There are a lot of, there tend to be a lot of steps that have to be made, both in the U.S. bureaucracy, but also on the Taiwan side, and finding a way to accelerate and push through those, again, given the sense of urgency, I think is critical.
But I just want to drill down a little bit to your comments to Nikkei. So the feeling there was that Taiwan wasn't going fast enough. Is that correct?
That is correct. I think that's been a feeling generally in Washington for a number of years now, even before Ukraine sort of happened. I think on the PLA side, on the China side, I actually don't think there have been a lot of big surprises. We've been tracking sort of the general trends of their development, their desire to build the capacity and the capabilities needed to successfully, you know, execute something with a relatively low risk. In other words, execute an invasion of Taiwan. And so it's not that we didn't see this coming. I think there's a little bit of a belated response now, and it's time to see if we can play catch up.
Vincent, is Taiwan going too slow?
I think that we're trending in the right direction. And so if you look at GDP growth for our military spending, it's gone from about 1.7% in 2016 to about 2.4% today. And so we're engaged in military reform, reserve reform. We're making changes to the way that, for example, we're building up capacity for more of civil defense. I think things are going in the right direction. Obviously, I think there's a question to be made about whether, you know, the steps that are being taken commensurate with the timeline that the CCP has sort of placed down. But I do think that, given time, I think we'll see these defense reforms, these defense procurements, indigenous development accelerate. And so as we see this accelerate, I'm hopeful that we will be able to meet that challenge of whatever time frame the CCP may have put in place.
Ivan, before we move to the next section, there is another weakness which analysts have talked about, and that's lack of joint command experience. And I wanted to get your view on the promotion of General He Weidong to the Central Military Commission, the PLAs, and the top committee there. He has some joint command experience, largely because of the drills that were carried out after Nancy Pelosi's visit. How significant is that?
I think there is some significance to that. I mean, for China, they completely restructured their military, I think, roughly 5 years ago, from these regional army military regions to create joint commands. And He Weidong, for the last 3 years, has commanded the Eastern Theater Command, which is a joint command. So even without the actual post-Pelosi experience, he's been in command of a joint unit, It's kind of the equivalent of our U.S. Indo-PACOM, you might say. But he's been in charge of that for 3 years now. And so I think having that experience of integrating, even in training and preparations and exercises, is probably something that was considered, I would assume, in his promotion to vice chairman.
Okay. Now, on the US side, on October 27th, the 2022 National Defense Strategy was unveiled. It outlines the strategic direction for national security for the US. This year's defense strategy states, quote, the PRC's increasingly provocative rhetoric and coercive activity towards Taiwan are destabilizing, risk miscalculation, and threaten the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. It goes on to say this is part of a broader pattern of coercive PRC behavior that stretches across the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and along the line of actual control. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin released the unclassified version of the strategy.
The key theme of the NDS is the need to sustain and strengthen U.S. deterrence with the People's Republic of China as our pacing challenge. As the President's National Security Strategy notes, the PRC is the only competitor out there with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the power to do so.
That was US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at the launch of the National Defense Strategy. Ivan, you were in the National Security Council from 2018 to 2021. It was a period where the US had its biggest shift in policy toward China in 40 years. This was also, the end of the Trump presidency, the beginning of Biden's. Could you paint the picture for us, because I understand that you're quite intimate with the defense strategies and security strategy. Could you paint the picture of how the US sees the China threat and how it might have changed over the past 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think 5 to 10 years, and I would stress even 10 years even more. Obviously 10 years is when Xi Jinping came into his position. And so I would tell you that this shift that you saw, a lot of people will credit the Trump administration, which was obviously the time that we saw the biggest movements of it. But the groundwork was laid, I think, in the Obama administration, when sort of the views on where China was going, the direction they were going, were starting to really become more and more pessimistic in Washington. And so with the Trump administration coming in, and you saw it in that national security strategy in 2017, that national defense strategy in 2018, was sort of the clearest articulation, or the first rather articulation of that shift. And I think that has continued, and I think with a very large amount of continuity from the Trump administration back again, switching parties again, to the Biden administration.
So in that 2017, 2018 strategies, was it the naming of China for the first time as a challenge?
It was the naming of China and Russia as competitors and as sort of the primary challenges to U.S. national security. And that was a shift from 20 years pointing towards terrorism as sort of, in the Middle East and Afghanistan as sort of our primary threat.
And could I ask, what was the trigger during the Obama administration?
Well, I think there were a number. There were a series of events I think folks may remember that had to do with, the cybersecurity. A lot of the economic espionage things were starting to really come to fore. The cases that we're seeing, and then overall, PLA, military development, expansionism, and some of those impacts that we had. And then obviously, I think we all sort of remember the South China Sea and the building of these facilities on features in the South China Sea that the PLA went through.
Vincent, because there was the promise that there would be no building of the islands in the South China Sea, and yet it happened.
Well, when I was in DC from 2019 to 2021, I think what I saw, at least during the initial phases, was a lot of age-old assumptions about China's rise were completely overturned. And I think this was prevalent not only across the U.S. government, obviously, but across the scholarly community, across this China Watcher community, and so forth. And this idea that was based upon probably Deng Xiaoping's time, that China's rise would be peaceful and that economic liberalization would one day lead to political liberalization, I think that was entirely upended by Xi Jinping. And so because of Xi Jinping's actions in South China Sea against Taiwan, in Xinjiang and so forth, and against Hong Kong, to be clear, I think that has caused a lot of countries around the world, not just the United States, but also Taiwan, I mean, to a certain extent, to reassess our relationship with China and how we see this going forward. And so I think, in my time in DC, it was actually quite exciting to see these assumptions be challenged, but also to see policy arise out of that. And so I think Ivan, I worked with Ivan during my term in DC, and to see sort of U.S. government not only start labeling China as a competitor, but also lay out this whole of government strategy in terms of how they're going to respond to it economically, militarily, geostrategically, and so forth. I think that was really an accelerating process.
Ivan, sometimes it was easy to say in hindsight, isn't it? But what has been said is that the West was slow to wake up to this. Why was it so slow?
Well, I think, to be fair, the West was hopeful. Americans are optimistic. We believe in our values very strongly and believe that they are universal, meaning that they are sort of what people want, the ideas of freedom and democracy. And I think for a long time, we believed that, kind of like that would be the natural flow. And there was also this whole idea that we mentioned before that we were quite distracted from a security standpoint with war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was the focus. And in some ways, China was actually, at first, a partner in that type of arena. Came to find out later that they were actually just using, I think, counterterrorism as an excuse to conduct, in the end of the day, human rights abuses. But that was sort of the belief for a long time, and it was a hedging strategy, to be more clear, that was hopeful towards the optimistic end. And I think, by the time Xi Jinping came in, it started to become clearer and clearer that hedge wasn't going to pay off.
Did you feel a distinct shift when he came on board?
I don't think it was distinct at all. I think you could actually trace it back. Even from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, things kind of slowed down quite a bit as far as reform goes. I think in our views, both economically, if we look back again with the benefit of hindsight, things kind of leveled out even in the Hu Jintao era. And when Xi Jinping came on, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I recall there was actually some hope that things would then accelerate in the reform direction. And it took a couple years for us to kind of, well, more than a couple years for us to kind of conclude real decisively that it wasn't going to go that way.
Let me add some color to that as well. I mean, even in Taiwan, I think there are many people within the cross-strait community that was hopeful of that Xi Jinping would bring a different sort of mindset when it comes to Taiwan. I mean, he had served as governor of Fujian province. He had a lot of linkages actually to Taiwanese business people in Fujian. And so there was a lot of personal connections that, that obviously have diminished now, but actually were quite prevalent when he had sort of stepped in the national spotlight. And so even in Taiwan, I know that there was a lot of optimism that he would actually bring a sort of a different era of engagement between the two sides, and that he would be much more understanding and nuanced. And obviously that has all changed. So there was a lot of optimism in Taiwan as well.
I was going to say from Ivan's comments there that you would think that Taiwan would be the most suspicious, of China.
I think on the I think that too, but I think Taiwan is also has the most cause for optimism, right? Like, we want to be optimistic naturally because we're at risk. I mean, we want to imagine this idea that the Chinese would be able to coexist with Taiwan and that we wouldn't see military adventurism, because in the end, this affects everyday life of the 23 million people here in Taiwan. And so there's a lot of, I think, cause for optimism. And, if I could go there, I think there is still, a lot of optimistic circles in Taiwan today that are political in nature, but not necessarily grounded in reality. And so I think to that point about Ivan, you can say the U.S. is slow to respond. I think Taiwan, to a certain extent, was slow to respond as well. Yeah.
So there is this feeling that everybody wants to maintain the status quo, isn't it?
Not everybody.
Not everybody. Okay, Taiwan side, US side want to maintain the status quo. Let's turn to the US strategy on Taiwan. Again, in this sort of time frame, could you take us through, has it changed? How has it changed?
So, I mean, the US policy on Taiwan hasn't changed, and that's the US One China policy. I think that there are obviously nuances in the sense that when China takes actions to, in the United States' view, alter the status quo, whether that be in the military realm, diplomatic partners, for example, economic coercion, then the United States sees that as a change in the status quo and is going to take actions, as we saw over the past few years, in those same realms, including things like sending high-level officials to Taiwan in order to voice that displeasure and to kind of shift things back, I guess, toward what was the status quo. It's not the same status quo, but I think shift things back to more of a balanced approach. So that, I think, is how the U.S. is trying to, get through and continue to maintain the status quo. I think China's definition of status quo is quite different, and it has a lot to do with what's happening here domestically in Taiwan and what they view as, incremental independence, right? So I'll stop there.
China would say that, sending these senior officials, Nancy Pelosi, that was a provocation. And they're obviously arguing that somehow this changes the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, for the United States, there's our policy. Washington has a policy, the United States government has a policy. It's built on One China policy, and a visit from an official from the legislative branch is well within the bounds of that policy. There's historical precedent, granted it was a long time ago, but there is for it. So China's concerns, again, about the status quo amount to these, and they vocalize this, shows of support that the United States considers to be shows of support of Taiwan as a democracy, as an entire nation. China views as shows of support to a small band of separatists on the island, right? And so that's a very different sort of way to look at really essentially the same actions.
Vincent, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree with the sense that the Chinese definition of the status quo has shifted over time. I think it's obvious. Ivan referenced this, but so Newt Gingrich came in the 1990s as Speaker of the House. I think the Chinese actually did lodge a protest at the time, but definitely, I mean, they did not send fighter planes over our ADIZ, did not engage in military ventures, economic sanctions, and so forth. So the Chinese reaction to essentially what was the same sort of actions by the US side has shifted enormously. And so I think it becomes very, very difficult for the Chinese to say, oh, we want to maintain a status quo, oh, you're breaking a status quo, when in fact we're doing the exact same thing we did 20 odd years ago, but you have entirely a set of different responses. And so I think we have to be very clear-eyed in terms of what is within Taiwan's national interest, what's within the interest of our relationship, and what's in our long-term security interest, and we need to proceed according to that. So, I think to be clear, visits by senior legislative officials like Nancy Pelosi do enhance Taiwan's security. They enhance Taiwan's global recognition. I mean, after Nancy Pelosi came, we started to see parliamentarians in Canada, Germany, France, many other countries start to organize and to build, trips essentially to Taiwan to show support. And so if we believe that having stronger international ties is within Taiwan's long-term interest, then it becomes clear from Taiwan's perspective that we need to continue welcoming these visits, with the view that sure, there's going to be short-term turbulence, but in the long term, I think Taiwan does benefit from such attention from senior legislative leaders. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ivan, did you want to add to that? Or?
I guess I would just agree with Vincent. I think there's in my mind, there's a couple different ways of deterring China. One is what we started out talking about was, okay, they're building military capability and capacity, so we need to balance that out so that as their confidence goes up, maybe we are able to bring it down a little bit, just from a pure military sort of analysis and, wargaming type of standpoint. The other way is what Vincent was talking about, and I think we can build deterrence by encouraging Taiwan to have more ties with other countries, just period dot. And a lot of those ties have to end up being, I think, an economic, societal, including like family ties across borders and things like that, because it creates a sense in other countries that they have a bit more sort of skin in the game in Taiwan. And so if China were to attempt something, God forbid, then there would be costs that would then have to be borne by other folks. And I think that's important. And I think the Taiwan administration recognizes that and is generally looking for support from the international community. Yeah.
And the PRC is obviously doing everything that it can to isolate Taiwan on every single level.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me, quickly to one point. So the Chinese have protested, I think, strenuously over opening a new office in Lithuania, for example, over the past few years. But if you look at it, is this sort of action within the status quo? Absolutely. We have over 100 offices in non-diplomatic allies countries we don't have diplomatic recognition with around the world. Prior to 2017 and 18, actually, many of those offices had used Taiwan instead of Taipei. And so this change actually from Taiwan or ROC to Taipei is actually a relatively new one. So we had, for example, offices in the Middle East and Africa, as well as some Pacific island countries that had used Taiwan or ROC. And this was all changed because of Chinese political pressure to these countries. So, in a sense, if you're thinking about the status quo as the state of cross-strait relations in 2016, then building up this relationship with Lithuania is obviously well within it. So, even to that point, I think that goes to show about how much the Chinese recognition of what the status quo is has shifted in the past 2-3 years.
Now, thank you. Now, earlier I spoke to Gregory B. Poling, who directs the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at U.S. think tank CSIS, where he is a senior fellow. A leading expert on South China Sea disputes and maritime security across the Indo-Pacific, Gregory told me how civilian fishermen and vessels are being harnessed by China's military. The civilian ships, which are sort of moored in the South China Sea. Can you tell us a bit about what their function is and how they help to expand China's military?
China's been subsidizing fishing fleets to go operate in the southern reaches of the South China Sea since the 1980s, where it's not commercially viable to do so. And the reason that it has historically done that is because it shows the flag. It creates a false narrative that Chinese vessels have actually traditionally operated everywhere, all the way to the coast of Indonesia. Today, that system has become much more formalized, much more professional. So now you have hundreds of fishing boats that hold effectively paramilitary forces who never fish a day in their lives.
Could you tell us how this military-civilian fusion strategy could relate to Taiwan?
So Taiwan deals with a lot of the same harassment as everybody else in the South China Sea when it comes to fishing vessels and the maritime militia, but really any kind of vessel that China has decided could have a military use is being potentially put to a military use. We're seeing Chinese civilian roll-on, roll-off transport vessels and vehicle carriers, vehicle ferries being used to conduct joint training and exercises in preparation for a hypothetical invasion of the island. Those vessels are being built to specifications set by the Chinese government to ensure that they are big enough to hold military vehicles if they need to. And so it's not just fishing boats, it's any boat that China believes might someday have a military role.
I was interested that Taiwan's own Coast Guard fleet do actually have anti-ship missiles. Is this anywhere close to being a similar sort of strategy?
It's not. I mean, all Coast Guards are different. Some Coast Guards are part of navies, part of armed forces. Some Coast Guards are independent. What makes a Coast Guard is that its primary job is law enforcement. Now, if you are a Coast Guard in Asia who has to go up against the Chinese Coast Guard, then you probably need to be pretty well armed because the Chinese Coast Guard is the largest in the world with the largest boats in the world. Many of them are former PLA Navy vessels with pretty big guns on the deck. So there's nothing wrong with meeting like for like. What makes this different is that Taiwan and all of the other parties in Asia do not rely on civilian fishermen, civilian shipping and merchant marine vessels to be part of their military.
And you mentioned that this has been going on for decades. Is there a response to this? How does, for example, the US deal with this?
There's an on-the-water response, which is quite difficult, and that is to monitor, and if they really get out of hand, to try to interdict, arrest these vessels, treat them when possible as a law enforcement problem. And also, if they actually engage in military operations, to have clear rules of engagement to treat them like a military actor. And the U.S. has said that it will treat any Chinese vessel that threatens the lives of American sailors or soldiers as part of the military, regardless of what color the boat is. But there's also a broader diplomatic problem, and that is, how do you convince China to stop subsidizing this program because it's counterproductive? That is all about naming and shaming and imposing diplomatic costs by highlighting the illegal behavior that China is engaged in.
After the 20th Party Congress, do you believe that there is a chance of, persuading them that this is not in their interest? Or
I see very little evidence that Xi Jinping is going to be convinced to back off of his and the Chinese government's excessive claims in the South China Sea, or its increasingly aggressive behavior across the Taiwan Strait or on the Himalayan border, or any of a dozen other things. I think the best that the U.S. and allied partners are likely to do for the time being is hold the line. And then hopefully a future Chinese government will be more inclined to compromise.
I understand that China is wanting to incorporate AI into its military, and this is part of the military-civilian fusion. Can you talk about how that is part of this sort of the blurring of the lines between military and civilian?
Right, China wants to compete with the United States and other developed nation militaries at the high end of the technology curve, whether it's AI, quantum computing, advanced semiconductors, or anything else. What makes China unique is that it is impossible to distinguish between researchers at academic institutions or private companies who are engaged in military versus civilian research. Civil military fusion doctrine in China means that all research that could hypothetically have military uses is at the beck and call of the PLA anytime they want, which is why you've seen now the United States take steps to restrict the export of certain tools to make advanced semiconductors to China, or advanced chips to China, because it doesn't believe there is any such thing as a purely civilian researcher left in China anymore.
That was Gregory Poling from American security think tank CSIS, speaking to me from Washington about China's military-civil fusion strategy. Ivan, Gregory Poling talks about these civilian transport vessels which have been designed so that they can hold military vessels, and they've taken part in training. Is this a way that the PRC is trying to address the weakness that you identified of the lift capacity?
Yeah, I think it is, but when we talk about the civilian transport vehicles, I think we're talking about successive waves, if you will, because that first wave really needs to be military. The assumption with that first wave is that there will be opposition on the beach in Taiwan. And so the civilian vessels would follow on afterwards to bring sort of the larger equipment, even more troops and things like that, some of the heavy equipment. But the initial kick down the door wave would probably not consist of those.
Mm-hmm. Vincent, there are many scenarios that people talk about in terms of how China might try to take Taiwan. What do you believe would be the way that they would do it?
Well, I mean, I think if we look at wargaming, both taking place in DC and Taipei, I mean, there are various scenarios that have been floated. I mean, blockade is one of them, a seizure of offshore islands is another one, a full-on invasion, a cybersecurity attack, and so forth. So I think there's a variety of factors at play, but ultimately, I think it's going to be a full-total exercise to sort of imagine which is the scenario that Xi Jinping could most likely choose in coming years. I think that's going to be based on a variety of factors, factors that we're probably not going to be able to forecast today. For example, how the international situation is, how the international community potentially sees China, how Taiwan's defense is in coming years. And so, I think it's better for us to be prepared at the large picture, at the big picture that we're facing, which is to, yes, first of all, ensure that regardless of which scenario they choose, that we're going to increase cost and risk for the PRC. We're going to target vulnerabilities of the PRC. We're going to work together with international partners. And I think that's precisely the sort of strategy that we're focused on from a governmental perspective, from the Taiwan governmental perspective, instead of focusing on building up, a response based on one single potential scenario that could take place in coming years.
Ivan, Beijing is also wanting to target its weaknesses, just as Vincent said. Right. It wants to build the PLA into a world-class military by 2049. And it will do that through, I guess, this technology war. And as polling says, they want to compete with the US at the high end of the technology curve. And part of that is the strategy to do that, or part of it is a military-civilian fusion strategy. Does it sound to you at all like the Cold War in terms of, the theft?
Yeah, I think there are a lot, it's not 100% the same situation, but there are a large number of analogies that we can draw to the Cold War. Obviously, a lot of people will point to this economic interdependence between the United States and China that means it's not the Cold War. But I think you could also argue that, given a few more years, we're moving toward that. And what you see because of this mil-civ fusion is you see the United States instituting more sort of broad-based, countrywide controls on the flows of technology that go between the United States and China. And as these sort of accelerate and take hold, and we start to separate in certain strategic areas, including high-tech ones, that could be dual use, in other words, used for military applications, I think this does start to look more and more like the Cold War.
Do you agree with that, Vincent?
Well, I think, I think in Taiwan we have to do a lot of soul searching as well. I think Taiwan does have a high degree of economic dependence over in the PRC, but I think more broadly speaking, there is a lot of interdependence and interconnectivity between our high-tech industries and semiconductor industries in particular. And so I do think that the US, by really being out there and pushing the boundaries about, for example, what Ivan said, country-wide restrictions, especially in high-end technology, I do think that has given cover, I think, to companies in Taiwan as they think about these issues. And certainly I do think a shift is taking place here in Taiwan, especially as we see sort of reliance by our high-tech industries on business in China. And so I do think that shift will probably become more pronounced as time goes by. And I'm hopeful that as we build up a greater sort of economic relationship with the US based on, I think, the restarting of our trade talks, based on having new economic prosperity dialogues that have taken place, I think, twice over the past 3 years already. I think these sort of policy level dialogues, I think, will help build a broader consensus in terms of how we want to move forward between democracies, between Taiwan and the US, on the use on trade, on use of high-end technology, but also on trade flows, also on sort of new investment flows. And so I think overall, that's going to be helpful to reduce our economic dependence, and certainly I think the US economic dependence on the Chinese market.
The new global supply chains, which are built on democracy.
Right.
Let's go back to the chip export controls, which have been the most stringent yet. Critics of that say that it could be counterproductive, that basically China would be spurred to develop its own industry. Right. What do you say to those sorts of comments?
So I think that, what we can't forget amongst all the talk about decoupling or diversification away from China is that China has actually been at this game a lot longer than we have. I mean, the biggest US tech companies have been kept out of China for a lot longer than the US, was pushing Huawei out, for example, right? A decade before we started talking about doing the same kind of things. And so now Xi Jinping articulates this as dual circulation, which means self-sufficiency. But the other half of dual circulation, self-sufficiency is one of them, so they also want to control their supply chains and internalize them, indigenize them. The other half of dual circulation that we also need to pay a lot of attention to is they want to create dependency on China and countries around the world. And that's what we also need to seek to avoid. And so as that, those impulses on both sides of the Pacific happen, we'll again start to see supply chains separate, I think, as a result.
And if I could quickly add to that, I think if we look at the past 20, 30 years of history here, the Chinese are going to build up indigenous industry regardless of what the U.S. chooses to do. I mean, that was the trend line before all of these export controls on U.S. technology, but that was also the trend in terms of their semiconductor industry, for example, in terms of them poaching talent, not only from Taiwan, but other places around the world. And so they were on this process regardless. And so the question is not how much we're spurring them to develop an indigenous industry. The question is how much we're setting them back. And so I think that is something that should be the focus in terms of making sure that the Chinese are not able to push their technologies, particularly semiconductor industry, to the degree where they're going to be able to overtake, I think, Taiwan and other democracies in coming years.
Yeah, in the last few years, China has put tremendous amounts of money and capital and resources towards advancing their semiconductor industry, and they have not been very successful. So again, saying that these new controls would spur that sort of doesn't take some of that history into account, I think.
I spoke to Stephen Ezell, and he said one of the reasons for that is this sort of closed loop. The innovation is being stifled. Vincent mentioned, putting China back. How long do you think the US could do that? What are we talking about? A couple of years? Longer?
Yeah, so the US government has recently declared, and this was the National Security Advisor in mid-September, he said that, our goal is no longer to keep China's technology, and I think semiconductor was one of these examples, right? The prime example. It's no longer to keep them 1 or 2 generations behind. It's to stop them where they are. I'm not sure if he used those exact words, but it's to maximize that gap. So I think the question you ask is one that folks are waiting to see what happens. I mean, the U.S. is obviously going down this road now. One of the biggest questions will be whether the allies on the U.S. side will cooperate with that goal in mind, and I think that's going to be probably the major determining factor in how successful it is.
Vincent, so over here in Taiwan, TSMC is cooperating. How about other companies? Are they less willing to cooperate?
Well, I think all tech companies are going to look where the market is, and I think the end market for many of their products are going to be the United States. And so I think there's going to be a high degree of compliance with export controls, with tech transfer controls instituted by the US, and I do see that trend already taking place, not only here in Taiwan, but obviously across the globe as well. So, ultimately, I think people are going to realize that this is within their own business interests as well. I mean, if they do see a Chinese industry that's on the verge of overtaking their own, I mean, very soon Taiwan will not have a semiconductor industry left. And so, in the long term, in the short term, I think there's going to be perhaps some sacrifice in terms of profits and revenue, but I think in the long term, it's probably for the tech industry to realize that.
Ivan, the Chinese say, in terms of military-civil fusion strategy, they say that actually they're modeled on the US's. Is there any truth to this?
So I think in the United States, there's obviously very close collaboration between our academia, our researchers.